I'm Helena. I went over plastic waste a little bit in Thursday's seminar, but I mostly related it back to how recycling doesn't mean we are necessarily reducing the amount of plastic waste that we produce. But today I'm going to go connect it back to environmental justice and how a lot of the plastic waste, because it's not recycled, ends up in lower income communities. So first I'm going to mention what mismanaged plastic is, and that term refers to plastics that have a high chance of entering oceans through waterways and coastal tides. So as of right now, mismanaged plastic isn't the #1 source of plastic waste. Most plastic is actually stored in landfills or it's like littered around communities and cities. But in the next few decades, if we continue producing plastic waste at the rate that we are, a lot of this will end up back in the ocean. And once it's in the ocean, first of all, it's really hard to remove, because it's out in the ocean. But also once it releases like microplastic and toxic chemicals, it can spread way quicker than if it were on land. So as you can see on the map, a lot of the countries that are high in plastic waste or estimated to be high in plastic waste by 2025, according to our world in data, is located in Asia, primarily in China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, India, and there's 2 countries back in Africa, Nigeria and Egypt. And these are all plastic importers. So by plastic importers, it means that a lot of the plastic that's exported from the US or other European countries are imported back to these countries in the hopes of them being recycled. Obviously, as I mentioned before, not all of this plastic waste actually ends up getting recycled because plastic waste in itself is very difficult to recycle. It gets contaminated really easily, and there's too many types of plastics to be recycled efficiently. But also in these countries, they have very poor recycling infrastructure, and yet these are the exact countries that we're putting our plastic waste in. Next slide. So going back to how plastic waste is traded around the world, a lot of the waste that we end up producing will become mismanaged. And this is because, as I mentioned before, the US and Europe primarily ship their millions of tons of plastics back to mid to low income countries, which primarily lie in Southeast Asia. And because they're so overwhelmed with plastic, as you can see by these pictures, it cannot be recycled efficiently. So it ends up being mismanaged, it ends up going to landfills, and a lot of it ended up being dumped into vulnerable communities. And that's how it relates back to environmental justice, because a lot of these communities are filled with low-income people who don't have the correct recycling infrastructure, who don't have correct waste management, and therefore you can see by these pictures, it's the citizens, the residents themselves that are picking up after their waste instead of it being regulated by more proper waste management techniques. And as you can see, some of these communities are completely buried by plastic. And at this point, there's a lot of people who want to get rid of it. And some people turn to burning the plastic, which is just as toxic, if not more toxic, than just leaving it dumped in their communities. Next slide. So because of issues like this, China, which was the #1 plastic importer back in 2018, instituted a plastic import ban, and this ban stopped the import of 7 to 9 million tons of global plastic per year. And since this ban, plastic imports in China have decreased by 99%, but because of this, 95% of Europe's plastic waste and 70% of the US's plastic waste has not been able to go back to China, and 110 to 120 million tons of plastic waste has been displaced. And displaced means it doesn't have anywhere to go. So a lot of it right now is still in our country. So the US has a lot of plastic that's just building up in our countries right now. And this can have a lot of side effects. So first of all, plastic waste, because the US is trying to get rid of their plastic waste, it's burdening a lot of other plastic importers. So not China, but it can go back to Taiwan or Vietnam. And a lot of these countries, just like China, have very poor recycling management, and it can leak back to vulnerable communities. And it also is going to displace a lot of recycling plant workers, and in the long run, it's also going to increase the cost for consumers to purchase plastic. So there are obviously pros to this, and it's that exporting countries will have to start improving their domestic recycling. So the US, because it's a very high income country, it can afford to manage their waste better rather than exporting it back to China and other plastic importing countries. So by China putting a plastic import ban, it's really emphasizing the need to focus on domestic recycling and domestic plastic waste management. And overall, it's also pushing for the decrease of global plastic production. As I mentioned before, at the rate that we're producing plastic waste, there's no way that, especially since China banned the imports of plastics, there's no way that we can keep producing the amount of plastic that we do and still expect to have a clean earth and communities that are safe from plastic health concerns. Next slide. So there's a couple ways that we can approach this. On an individual scale, we can focus on going into zero waste, reusing, not littering, recycling as a last resort. But according to our world in data, even if all countries across Europe cut out plastic use completely, global mismanaged plastic would decline by less than 5%. And this would mean that a lot of this can't be placed on the burden of individuals. It has to come from a higher up scale, and that means the government. So Fiona and Trisha both went into this a little bit, but because the government has so much power, and like I said, because the individuals only make up for 5% of the world's plastic use, we need to start thinking about how we can apply governmental enforcements and legislation. So one being, I touched on this a little bit, but investing in domestic plastic management, especially in high-income communities like countries like the US that can afford it, and in mid to low countries that are acting as plastic importers right now, they can start taxing their plastic imports. And this might seem like a concern to some people, because if you start taxing your plastic imports, maybe plastic exporting countries will stop exporting their plastics, and these mid to low income countries that do rely on the plastic waste trade are going to lose money. But in actuality, as I said before, because so much of plastic waste is displaced already, a lot of these exporting countries are really eager to get rid of their plastic waste. And so if plastic importing countries start taxing the imports, they're going to have money to fund and improve recycling infrastructure so that more plastics can go back into the recycling stream as opposed to getting dumped into lower income communities. And we also have to start eliminating mismanaged waste, and this comes from regulating how we store our waste. So we need to secure our trash in landfills, encourage people not to litter, because like I said before, in landfills, the health concerns of plastics are already high, but once it's back in the oceans, or once it heads into the oceans, it becomes magnified. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. Next slide. So I'm going to touch really briefly on how we can start redesigning the economy. And all of these ideas are very broad and they're very idealistic, but these are some ways that we can start implementing a more sustainable lifestyle as opposed to just relying on improving the plastic waste trade. So one of them would be to go to a circular economy, and this would mean designing the economy to reduce material waste. So instead of manufacturing goods from new materials and generating waste, we keep it in the economy and we reuse materials over and over again. So this includes things like composting to reduce food waste, making compostable products like biodegradable packaging and plastics. It includes remolding metals or reusing parts from past technical appliances like phones, fridges, and microwaves to build new appliances that are obviously coming out at a very quick rate. So instead of making an iPhone, I don't even know if there's an iPhone 12, but it's probably coming out. If you make an iPhone 12 out of completely new metals, that means a lot of the iPhones that people have right now are just getting wasted and thrown into landfill. So instead of doing that, a lot of people are supporting the idea of turning these iPhones in so that you can reuse the metals and the wires that are in there. You can also start licensing products instead of buying your own, and this ties a little bit into the sharing economy. The sharing economy is very broad, and the type I'm going to focus on is the one that reduces ownership of material goods. So this includes things like using eBay to resell goods, and thrifting or renting clothes. Isha's going to go a little bit into this in the fast fashion segment, but doing that also means you don't end up producing more clothes in the first place. You can also start sharing food, and food sharing apps like Olio lets you, instead of just throwing the food away that you have leftovers of, or you just took a bite out of but you end up not liking, you can post about it on a food sharing app, and you can ask a neighbor to take it from you. And you can also do this in schools where you have share tables where people who might not want the fruit option that they got can put it on a share table, and people that do want it, who might not be able to afford more food that day, would be able to take it. And there's also apps like for car sharing like Uber and Lyft, and these are all aspects of the sharing economy. Yeah, so that's it. Yep. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I guess I don't really understand why countries would import another country's plastic waste. Like, do they get paid to do that?
Yeah, it's part of the trade. So sorry. Yeah, so when China accepts these plastics, they end up being paid for it. But like China, as you know, has a pretty its economy is definitely better off than like the other countries that I mentioned inside Southeast Asia. So it can afford to stop participating in the plastic waste trade, but because a lot of these countries can't afford to do that, it's really up to us to like manage it in our own homes, but also to like deal with their taxing and stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what are those countries supposed to do with the plastic?
They're supposed to recycle it. That's the reason why it gets shipped there. But like I said, like it doesn't end up getting recycled a lot. So it just ends up being dumped and like thrown away.
I have a question. So, I think, like, in reaction to that, I think some people would say, like, shouldn't we continue giving plastic to these countries, especially underdeveloped, like, developing countries, because they, like, gain a profit from us shipping waste to them, even if they don't have, like, the infrastructure to recycle it. Do you think there's a solution to that? Like, if we manage to just like keep the plastic, or like keep the flow of plastic from them, do you think there will be like a solution to the flow of profit that we would be cutting off as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned, so instead of saying like cut out the plastic waste trade entirely, I talked about improving it. So like one of the things would be like, so maybe we can stop sending as much plastic to the developing countries, but the developing countries can also tax the plastic that they do receive. So in the end, they end up making the amount they need to sustain themselves, but they're not actually receiving as much plastic in the first place.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you talk about waste mismanagement, is that like people not properly cleaning their recyclables, or like the waste companies themselves not doing a good job?
So the term mismanagement, like, it's like purely reserved for the plastic that ends up in the oceans. So like what you're talking about right now, that's obviously like an issue. But when I say mismanagement, it's like it's dedicated to the plastic that ends up in the oceans. So that can be like from what you said, but also like not having them correctly in landfills or just dumping them in the streets.
Okay.